It's not just a man's world anymore. Reel to Reel spotlights the women who broke ground in Hollywood. Next, only on AMC. If you want to ace AMC Screen Test online, then you better pay close attention to tonight's documentary. Next on Hollywood Reel to Reel.
Tonight on AMC's Hollywood Reel to Reel, it's Real Models, the first women of film. That makes it a three-reeler. It features Alice Guy, Lois Weber, Dorothy Arzner, and screenwriter Frances Marion, all trailblazers in the male-dominated motion picture industry from the time of the silent films on. We'll hear from Shirley MacLaine and Francis Ford Coppola during the next hour, and then a film festival featuring the works of some of these pioneering women. Here's Real Models, the first women of film.
Hello, I'm Barbra Streisand, and I'm delighted to bring you the stories of 4 women filmmakers, pioneers in their field. Their lives and accomplishments, told through recently discovered films and first-hand accounts, are extraordinary. In 1896, a young French secretary named Alice Guy was the first woman to direct a film. And at a time when women couldn't even vote, she would own and run her own studio. 20 years later, Lois Weber was the highest paid director at Universal Studios. She boldly took on taboo subjects such as prostitution, anti-Semitism, even birth control. A stunning ingenue named Frances Marion wrote Mary Pickford's greatest hits and Greta Garbo's first spoken words on the big screen. The early days of filmmaking were the golden age for women. They wrote at least half of the scripts, can you imagine? And there were nearly 30 women working as directors. But by 1927, as the studios got bigger, men were in charge, and most of the women were out. Dorothy Arzner was the only woman director left in Hollywood. As producers, writers, directors, and studio heads, these women made enormous contributions. But today their names are virtually unknown. Their innovations and achievements often attributed to others. So I'm very happy to be joined now by Shirley MacLaine, Susan Sarandon, Hilary Swank, and Minnie Driver, who will present the surprising and fascinating stories of the first women in film.
She did what few people had done, and certainly what no woman had ever done before. More than a century ago, a 22-year-old French woman named Alice Guy produced and directed one of the first movies ever made. In a remarkable career that spanned 2 continents, she went on to make hundreds of films, helping to lay the foundation for movie making as we know it today. But over the years, most of her films were lost. They were destroyed or credited to others. Now, only recently, as dozens of her films have been rediscovered, has Alice Guy begun to regain her rightful place in motion picture history. Alice Guy grew up in Victorian-era Paris at the dawn of the modern age. Learning to use the newly invented typewriter got Alice Guy her first job as a secretary with Léon Gaumont, an inventor and producer of camera equipment. This rare footage shows Alice Guy when she was a young woman living in Paris. She was fascinated with cameras and their creative possibilities. She wasn't the only one. In the cafes of Paris, people were buzzing about a new and curious invention, pictures that moved, seen through a viewfinder. The moving pictures only showed brief scenes from ordinary life, but to people seeing them for the first time, they were magical. But there was a problem. Only one person could look at a time. The race was on to find a way to show them to a mass audience. The Lumiere brothers, a team of inventors, were one of the first to find a solution. They devised a reliable method to project motion pictures on a screen. Now, these intriguing images could be seen by large groups of people at one time. In the winter of 1895, Léon Gaumont was invited to see this exciting new development in photography and asked his young secretary, Alice Guy, to go with him. They saw this short film of workers leaving the Lumiere brothers' factory. Seated in a darkened room, watching these primitive pictures projected on the wall, Alice Guy had a sudden insight. Why not use film to tell stories? With this simple thought, Alice Guy began a remarkable 28-year career as one of the world's first filmmakers.
She and Gaumont came out afterwards, got into their carriage, and she turned to him and said, "People are going to get bored of these films. What's really interesting is to tell a story." And Gaumont just shrugged it off and said, "Oh, it's just a child's toy. It's not going to go anywhere. But if you want to play with it, you can, as long as it doesn't interfere with your regular job."
My youth, my inexperience, my sex, all conspired against me. If the future development of motion pictures had been foreseen at the time, I should never have obtained his consent.
A few weeks later, Alice Guy directed one of the first narrative films ever made, La Fée aux Choux, The Cabbage Fairy. For almost half a century, the film was believed lost or destroyed. Only recently, this remake of the original film was discovered in a Swedish archive. Alice Guy is the young woman on the left, dressed like a man. It's hard to imagine what an extraordinary achievement this was in 1896. With Gaumont's equipment and her friends as actors, this young French secretary had written, produced, and directed a 1-minute-long movie that had all the elements of a modern-day feature: a narrative storyline, sets, costumes, and a cast. Most early films like this one were not used as entertainment, but to help sell the new motion picture camera. But this was about to change. Now that films could be projected, large groups of people were flocking to see them at churches and fairs. Alice Guy began producing and directing dozens of short films for Gaumont on the condition that she complete her secretarial duties first.
She would go there at 8 o'clock in the morning, work until about noon. Then she had to take a tram or a trolley all the way across Paris. She would work there for 4 hours making her films because she needed the sunlight. Then she had to take the tram all the way back and work until 11 o'clock at night to finish up all the paperwork.
After 2 years, the demand for her films was so great that Guy was finally able to leave her job as a secretary, making movies for Gaumont full-time. Early in her career, Alice Guy made decisions that would permanently help define the role of the filmmaker. In those days, the director also operated the camera. Though technically skilled, Guy made the historic decision to leave the camera work to others, creating the role of the director. These extraordinary pictures at the turn of the century show Alice Guy at work on the set.
Alice Guy was able to become, in fact, probably the world's first director, certainly the world's first female director.
Alice Guy was one of the first directors to make movies with sound. She made over 100 using a process developed by her boss, Léon Gaumont. Wax cylinders played back pre-recorded sound, and the actors lip-synced the voices.
So if you see some of the Alice Guy musicals of the period, it's almost like watching an MGM musical of the 40s or 50s, because the technique is the same.
Many of Alice Guy's early films were also in color, hand-tinted 40 years before Technicolor. Alice Guy was both revolutionary in her style and daring in her subject matter. In this 1906 film, Madame Has Her Cravings, she pioneered the use of the close-up for dramatic effect.
It's a close-up of a woman, She's pregnant, and she runs around town looking for phallic objects that will satisfy her cravings. So it's probably the first time that a close-up is used to represent a character's internal state. Later, D.W. Griffiths took credit for dramatic use of the close-up, but that was 2 years later, in 1908.
Alice Guy was now firmly established as the first and only female director in the world, a leader in the vanguard of early filmmaking. It was 10 years since Alice Guy had made her first film. Her instincts had been right and her hard work was paying off. The film business was booming. To satisfy the insatiable demand for new films, Gaumont built his 32-year-old former secretary a new studio, and he put her in charge of production. Once again, Alice Guy was a first, the first woman to ever run a motion picture studio.
She was the first to direct exclusively. She was the first to produce and direct. She pioneered studio management techniques. She trained actors and set designers and cameramen. She had directors working under her. So early French cinema was basically built under her tutelage. She was a one-woman film school.
But the greater her success and the bigger the profits, the more resentment and hostility Guy faced from the men in her company.
This period was hard for me. I had been left to work out alone the difficulties at the beginning, to break new ground. But when the affair became interesting, doubtless lucrative, my directorship was bitterly disputed.
Most of the nearly 400 films Alice Guy made in France have been lost. Of those that have survived, her 1906 30-minute-long feature, The Life of Christ, is the most impressive. Elaborate lighting setups were required, and masses of actors had to be carefully choreographed. Nothing comparable in size or scale would appear in the United States for at least 10 years. Alice Guy, now 33, was head of a major studio, financially independent and one of France's most celebrated filmmakers. But Guy's life was about to change forever. When she met and married a Gaumont employee named Herbert Blanchet, shortly after the wedding, the studio announced they were transferring her new husband to the United States, effective immediately. Suddenly, Alice Guy, now also known as Madame Blanchet, found herself on a steamship, watching everything she had ever known and done fade slowly into the distance. What Alice Guy couldn't know at the time was that the center of the film industry was moving with her across the ocean from Paris to America.
Up until 1914, France was the main film producer in the world and also the main film market. Between 1907 and 1914, things began to shift to the United States. So Alice Guy left France and went to the States at the exact right time.
In those days, movies were not being made in Hollywood. Movies were being made in New York City. Nickelodeons were everywhere. They ran from morning to night. Millions of working-class Americans went day after day to watch a half hour of movies for a nickel. It was into this exciting and electric atmosphere that Alice Guy arrived in New York in 1907. The following year, she gave birth to a daughter and settled down as a housewife and a mother while her husband ran Gaumont's New York studio. But domestic life was not enough for Guy.
She saw that the studio was sitting empty a lot, and she couldn't stand it. And so she said, "You're letting the studio sit there empty. Let me make some films."
Many early movies, such as The Execution of an Elephant by Electricity, contained shocking images that were considered inappropriate for a general audience. As theater owners and film distributors tried to lure more women and children to their movies, they began to recruit women for jobs both in front and behind the camera.
Filmmakers had the idea that perhaps if they brought more women into the industry, the women might bring a sense of respectability to an industry, really, which was, trying to find a foothold, trying to become part of the American establishment.
Seizing the opportunity, Alice Guy and her husband Herbert Blanchet formed Solax Film Company, and Gaumont agreed to distribute their films. In 1910, Alice Guy began making films again, this time for an American audience. She was stunned to find that American cameramen and technicians were unfamiliar with many of the special effects that she had pioneered 10 years earlier in France. In 1912, just after the birth of their second child, Guy built a huge new studio in Fort Lee, New Jersey. The state-of-the-art facility contained projection rooms, labs, and enough floor space for 5 stages. Even while running her own studio, Guy remained a hands-on filmmaker. Her movies were unique and audacious, mixing traditional male and female roles at any opportunity.
And she didn't stop at anything. And I think the fact that she was a woman in a man's world made her lose all fear. Once you got that far, why stop there? Just keep going, do everything you want to do. And she did.
She made adventure films and westerns with female action heroes. One of her westerns, Algie the Miner, is about a thinly disguised homosexual love affair. She made cross-dressing comedies. In Officer Henderson, policemen dress up as women to go undercover. Alice Guy was also known for realism and attention to detail. She preferred to use actual locations instead of artificial-looking sets. For her film The Sewer, about urban crime, Guy created a sewer with real waste and spent more than a week training live rats. Her use of light and shadow predated film noir by some 40 years. In less than a decade, Alice Guy had become nothing short of an icon in the American film industry, one of the architects of its extraordinary success. But a series of crushing blows were about to topple her, both professionally and personally. First, Solax received devastating financial news when the American Thomas Edison pushed Gaumont out of the distribution business in the United States. Without a distributor, Guy found herself and Solax in mounting financial trouble. The bad news only got worse. Guy's marriage of 15 years was shattered when her husband ran off with a young actress, leaving Guy with 2 children to support and a failing business.
She has multiple problems. She has the end of her marriage. She's still trying to keep that together. She's trying to provide a home for her 2 children. And at the same time, she wasn't keeping abreast of what was happening in the industry. Her films were relatively old-fashioned in later years compared to those of many of her contemporaries.
Hoping to get back on her feet, Alice Guy agreed to direct a low-budget film that she might have otherwise refused, called Tarnished Reputations. The film was not a commercial success. 5 reels of anguish, wrote one reviewer. Sadly, it was the last film Alice Guy would ever direct. Solax went bankrupt, and Alice Guy and her husband were eventually divorced. In an attempt to revitalize her career, Guy returned to France, hoping to find work in the industry she had helped pioneer. But it was not to be. There were no offers to direct, no movies to produce, no studio to run. After a lifetime spent shattering stereotypes and shaping the future of the film industry, Alice Guy experienced a quick, painful descent into oblivion. Her 28 years in the movie business were not only over, but she and her remarkable films would soon be almost completely forgotten.
To me, it's very disturbing that Alice Guy is always relegated to almost a secondary spot in film history, because, of course, she was a unique pioneer. She's every bit as important as people like D.W. Griffith or Cecil B. DeMille.
Almost a century ago, Alice Guy wrote, "It has long been a source of wonder to me that many women have not seized upon the wonderful opportunities offered to them by the motion picture art. There is probably none in which they can make such splendid use of their talents, so much more natural to a woman than to a man. Alice Guy's extraordinary career paved the way for many other women filmmakers, among them Lois Weber.